Welcome back. Since we are talking about shaping behavior from different aspects in terms of conditioning, that is classical conditioning, instrumental conditioning, then reinforcement, today we will continue our discussion. We will further our discussion with another theory of shaping behavior, that is behavior modification or OB mod. This is an acronym given to behavior modification. This is another technique strategy in terms of shaping behavior of employees at workplaces and is very much another approach to learning theory in organizational settings. Behavior modification or OB mod characteristically uses positive reinforcement to encourage desirable behaviors in employees. No doubt that any desirable behavior, irrespective of any situation, it is being rewarded. At the same time, there are certain situations at workplaces when there are situations which are not in alignment with the performance, but how the situation can be understood or factors can be identified in order to improve the performance and at the same time reinforce those performances. This strategy and approach to shaping behavior has a background based on a classic study which took place a number of years with freight packers at Emery Air Freight, which is now known as FedEx. It is a US company. This company wanted packers to use freight containers for shipments whenever possible because of specific economic savings. So, the idea is to save some finances, money of the organization. The management wanted that the employees, the workers should use freight containers for shipments. When packers were asked about the percentage of shipments contained, the standard reply was 90%. That means, it was a generic idea that was being asked by the employees and this is what they responded, that the percentage of shipments contained is 90%. When an analysis was performed by Emery, it was found that the actual container utilization rate was only 45%. So, what the picture employees posed to the management was completely different when they actually in physical analyzed the whole data and it was found that the utilization rate was only 45%. So, in order to encourage the employees to increase the use of containers, the manager established a program of feedback and positive reinforcements. Now, here what kind of feedback and positive reinforcement mechanism was developed? Each packer was instructed to keep a checklist of daily packings, both containerized and non-containerized. And at the end of each day, the packer computed the container utilization rate, that is from one employee to another. Every employee was supposed to maintain a data that how much containers were used for shipment and how much was not used. Almost unbelievably, container utilization jumped to more than 90% on the first day of the program and held at that level. So, when every employee was asked to maintain the data based on feedback and reinforcement, so everybody was motivated because of that reinforcement and it increased the use of container for shipment. Emery reported that this simple program of feedback and positive reinforcement saved the company $2 million over a 3-year period. So, what was the organizational goal was to save some money or pursue some economic goals, and how they changed the behavior of employees in order to encourage, perform positive behaviors or appropriate behavior in terms of increasing the use of the containers for shipment based on feedback and reinforcement, and what was the outcome. So, outcome was double. First of all, it saved money, that is $2 million money was saved in 3 years, and at the same time it encouraged employees to understand the value of money and time and how they can improve their behavior based on feedback and reinforcement. So, based on this case study, a typical OB modification program was established in order to solve any problem. So, what was the problem at FedEx, at Emery? The problem was to increase the use of containers for shipments based on feedback and reinforcement. So, how that problem was solved? Ultimately, that Emery Air Freight established a reinforcement or behavior modification program to solve any problem at workplaces in 5 stages. The first is identify critical behaviors. What was the critical behavior in the case? That initially the employees informed that the use of the container is 90%, but actually it was just 45%, just half. Develop baseline data. This was the baseline data that when Emery collected the data, it was only the use that is 45%, not 90%. And identifying the critical behavior that encourage employees to use the containers as much as they can. The third is functional analysis to identify behavioral consequences. That means that what behavior should be encouraged so that the container use should be increased, and what should be the consequence of those behavior. Fostering, motivating appropriate behavior. So, what was the functional analysis? That employees were the focus to inculcate, encourage those behaviors which have positive consequences. What was the positive consequences? That it has to be performed to an extent that it should save money in next 3 years. That is what they could achieve. Develop and apply intervention. So, what was the intervention to develop? It was about the feedback mechanism and the reinforcement criteria. So, based on positive feedback, that how many employees would shrug off their duty for not performing the work, and how much have been reinforced for performing their duty by accepting to use the containers as much as they can, and evaluate performance improvement. Now, as soon as the reinforcement mechanism was implemented, performance was also evaluated based on different parameters, and it was found that almost every employee's performance was enhanced based on positive feedback. Now, here positive feedback was something based on the social norms at the workplaces, how many would like to participate in that strategy or mechanism, how many of them wanted to escape from that mechanism, because organization demands to increase your performance based on behavior also, then everybody has to put in lot of effort. So, this is about evaluate performance improvement. This was the base model, a 5-step problem solving base model, where behavior modification program is being developed in every organization depending on the situation and the employees. Now, this is something a very generic baseline or structure of the OB modification behavior, but how it is being performed, it has more intricacies to understand the same thing. So, we will go into a more detailed plan that what it identifies. So, still continuing based on this model, identify critical behaviors. So, that this is the first step in OB modification that makes a significant impact on the employee's job performance. These are those 5 to 10% of behaviors that may account for up to 70 to 80% of each employee's performance. A simple task was to encourage employees to make maximum use of containers for shipment. So, only 5 to 10% of change in the behavior would account for 70 to 80% of each member's performance. So, freight packers using containers whenever possible at Emery Air Freight is an example of a critical behavior. Now, any critical behavior or factor can not be only the big one. A small behavior can also bring a major change in the whole functioning of the organization. The second step requires a manager to develop some baseline data. So, this is obtained by determining the number of times the identified behavior is occurring under present conditions, as we did in reinforcement. Every time the employee is performing a desired behavior, a data is being maintained. In the Emery freight packing example, this was a revelation that 45% of all shipments were containerized. That means, apart from that, how many times they are using the containers, how much is the use of the container and how much improvement is required, that entails the baseline data, right. The other is the third step, to perform function analysis to identify the behavioral contingencies or consequences, that what will foster the desirable behavior. So, this tells the manager the antecedent cues that emit the behavior and the consequences that are currently maintaining it. That means, to emit or to inculcate, to discourage or encourage behaviors, that there are certain behaviors that has to be declared as redundant, and certain behaviors have to be rewarded or emitted. So, at FedEx, social norms and the great difficulty in packing containers were the antecedent cues, that what are the factors that were discouraging employees to perform a specific behavior, or what are the factors which are encouraging employees to perform a behavior. So, these were the social norms and the great difficulty in packing containers. Now, what are those social norms? So, This encouraged the practice of packing items separately. Moreover, the consequences of continuing the behavior prior to the OB mod intervention were social acceptance and escaping more demanding work. So, maybe encouraging employees to use more containers for shipment maybe requires lot of other tasks to perform, or maybe it is a tedious task. So, maybe employees were escaping to abide by the demands of the work, and how they were escaping, in what manner, those became the social norms, because when one employee is escaping, maybe another 10 employees will also escape from that task. So, these are the social norms that were established on their own in an unsaid manner, and how those behaviors were identified and were eliminated from the whole process of behavior modification. So, once the functional analysis is complete, functional analysis means ultimately the manner in which employees are working. Now, that manner are actually the antecedent factors that encourage or discourage, motivate or demotivate employees to perform a particular behavior. Next is to develop and implement an intervention strategy. Why? To strengthen the desirable behavior or performance of the employees and weaken undesirable behaviors. The appropriate strategy will entail changing some elements of the performance reward linkage structures, process, technology groups or the task with the goal of making high level performance. Now, it is not only about from the employee's point of view, it is also about the organization's resources, the structure, the task that has to be performed, introduction of different and new technologies or upgradation of the technologies, so that it becomes more comfortable for the employees to perform a required task. For example, the work technology was altered to require the keeping of a checklist, the checklist plus the computation. Maybe initially it was manual to maintain the checklist or the inventory. Now, maybe it was computed. So, that made the task more simple for the employees. So, that was more encouraging, because some factors were actually encouraging or enhancing their performances while making certain process easy. So, at the end of the day, of a container utilization rate acted to reinforce the desirable behavior of using containers. So, there are certain factors where changes have to be induced in the work environment to foster the desirable behavior, and then they are being rewarded. And the final step is evaluate performance improvement. So, in this case, the immediate improvement in the container utilization rate demonstrated that behavioral change took place, that is, it rose to 90% when certain factors were introduced pertaining to work environment or quality of work life and reinforcement. The goal was achieved in terms of increasing the use from 45 to 90%, which indicates that learning took place. That is, employees underwent a relatively permanent change in behavior. So, this is how this behavior modification, OB modification model functions at different level. It is basically a strategic approach of learning, that how to identify the loss, how to incur profits, how to identify antecedents that leading to losses, and how to encourage those factors that would enhance the productivity, and how to sustain those performance or response behaviors. Okay, coming to the more advanced discussion of OB modification is based on this model given by Lutyens. So, the first is identify performance related behavioral events. So, these three kinds of organizational activity includes behavioral events, performances and organizational consequences. As I said, what are the pros and cons in a particular situation, how to deal and what factors to identify to eliminate the losses and incur profits, and how those factors can be retained or make sustainable, so that the productivity also enhances and performance also enhances. So, three factors have been taken care of. The first is behavioral events, performances and organizational consequences. So, what organizational consequences can be in terms of profits and enhancement. So, these behaviors should be observable, measurable and directly related to the organization's goals. For example, in FedEx example or MED cases only, initially it was the use of the container was just 45%. How to increase? So, identify the factors that will lead to increase in the use of the containers and reduce the losses. Or another example can be in sales organization, critical behaviors might include the number of customer calls made or the quality of customer interactions. So, not only making the calls, how many calls were quality calls, how to improve the quality of the calls that is being made to the customer, that is more important. So, this requires improvement in the technology, improvement in the communication skills of the employees, and at the same time improvement in enhancement of the knowledge of the employees while giving them more training to enhance their expertise, right. The other is measure baseline, the frequency of responses. So, this baseline measurement provides a reference point against which future changes in behavior can be compared. So, these are observable, self-reporting and performance data analysis and can be used to gather this information. How to gather this information? While understanding that what is the reason of low performances or low productivity and how it can be increased to higher levels. So, this is about measuring the performance in terms of units of performance or productivity. It is about percentage, frequency and time. For instance, in this case of FedEx only, that what are the factors and to what extent the use of containers is reducing or how it can be increased. The other is identifying existing behavioral contingencies through functional analysis. What are the antecedents that is encouraging certain behavior and how it should be encouraged or discouraged. Identifying factors leading to a particular pattern of behavior. So, the antecedents and consequences are associated with the critical behaviors analyzed to understand what triggers the behavior and what reinforces and discourages them. This analysis helps in designing interventions that can modify the behavior. So, this entails the social norms, behavioral patterns that are discouraging employees, what kind of team that has been constituted and are unable to perform. So, these are the factors, the norms, the professional and social norms that are encouraging or discouraging certain patterns of behavior and how it can be controlled. So, it is about antecedent, behavior and consequences to identify what behavior are inhibiting and to identify what behavior will encourage the performance, that is the stage which deals about all these aspects. And the fourth is develop intervention strategies. It is about consider environmental variables, structure, process, technology, groups and task. Improvement in technology, improvement in employees' performances by providing them appropriate training or learning and development, identifying task and employee based on person job fit and expertise, and how the structural process has to be enhanced in terms of hierarchy, in terms of communication and ultimately the groups in which employees are working. So, this also entails applying appropriate strategy and measure the performance in terms of frequency, that is after intervention. So, once changes have been introduced in the whole process based on task, structure, process, task, technologies and group, then what is the change in the behavior that is also being measured at this point of time. So, after implementing the intervention, it is crucial to evaluate its effectiveness and involves measuring the frequency of the critical behaviors and comparing them to the baseline measurements. So, initial and the present and the future, all the learning responses are being compared and what training would facilitate and which training would not facilitate, that will be the point where it will encourage or discourage the desirable or undesirable behaviors. So, continuous monitoring helps in assessing whether the intervention is producing the desired change in behavior and whether further adjustments are needed or not. So, continuous learning monitoring will enhance learning procedure, that when, where, at what point learning procedure should be enhanced or omitted from the whole process. And after the intervention step, managers again measure performance to determine whether the desired effect has been achieved or not. If not, then again the intervention strategy is redesigned. Maybe more reinforcement is required for a particular behavior to be demonstrated. If performance has increased, the manager must try to maintain the desirable behavior through some schedule of positive reinforcement. So, ultimately the point is that if the organization requires and understands that any particular behavior needs to be sustained in a particular group or among people or employees, then that behavior has to be reinforced. This reinforcement has to be positive so that every time the task is performed, the task is enhancing, and understand that whether the problem has been solved or not. And last is evaluate for performance improvement. This is about schedules of reinforcement, continuous and intermittent or self reinforcement, and the manager looks for improvements in individual employee behavior and the emphasis is on offering significant longer term rewards such as promotions or salary adjustments and to sustain ongoing efforts to improve performance. As I mentioned just now, that once the intervention has been introduced, the effectiveness is there, then it requires the organization to reinforce the effectiveness so that the performance is sustained. This is only possible when tangible rewards or benefits are being rewarded or being given to the employees in terms of promotions, salaries or bonuses. So, this is a detailed presentation of behavior modification program where not only the problem has been solved, but at the same time the problem has been solved by bringing major changes in the behavior of employees. It is not only about strategy, structure, process, technology, task or groups. It is more importantly about focusing on the behavior of employees which should be reinforced and sustained in long run. So, a number of organizations have used this model to improve employee productivity, to reduce errors, absenteeism, tardiness, accident rates and to improve friendliness towards customers. So, it is not only about effectiveness or efficiency, it is also about maintaining interpersonal relationships within organizations hierarchy, because when we require organization process to be changed or altered, it requires alteration from the overall basis. It is a holistic approach. For example, a clothing manufacturer saved $60,000 in 1 year due to fewer absences, because the behavior was the focus of the employees based on not only their behavior, some other factors also and or antecedent to what lead to reduced behaviors, that was improved and improved productivity to 16% and the errors were reduced to 40% and accidents were also reduced, and at the same time $1 million were saved by that organization. So, a bank successfully used OB mod to increase the friendliness of its tellers, which led to demonstrable improvement in customer satisfaction. This is again a very simple day life example. Whenever we go to bank, how bank tellers or managers would interact with the customers. The more their behavior is being trained, it is being reinforced by the organization, the more it has spillover effect on the customer, which leads to customer satisfaction. So, it has a great significance in OB in shaping behavior of employees based on reinforcement. So, reinforcement is something which will never become vague in the whole organization process, because employees are the assets of any organization, and once they are being sustained, they need to improve, they need to enhance and ultimately reinforce. So, what are the key takeaways of this approach to shaping behavior? That OB modification is based on the principles of behaviorism, particularly operant conditioning to B.F. Skinner, that is reward and punishment. It involves identifying, measuring and modifying behaviors within an organization to improve performance and productivity. Productivity and performance based on behavior of employees. It also sets clear objectives and goals for behavior modification. It helps in building a culture of continuous improvement and accountability, and utilizes interventions such as reinforcement and punishment to shape behaviors. So, that is how FedEx or Emery Freight Company was the base which became a classic case study for establishing behavior modification programs at workplaces, and how it is still functional to make the organization more effective at global marketplace and among employees at the same time. So, this is about OB modification. Thank you so much. We will continue our discussion in the next session. Thank you so much. Good luck.